Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we start the interview, I'd like to offer you a gift. I work with many queer folks who struggle with self-esteem, self-acceptance, and confidence. And I get it. Growing up queer is no cakewalk. Living in a world filled with homophobia and oppression can take its toll. Having the strength to be true to yourself can be a challenge, but you can change that. So, if you'd like support taking the first few steps, head over to my website and grab your free copy of The Self-Confident Queer. Just go to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident. This guide will walk you through 3 simple steps to help you begin to build your self-worth and confidence today. So head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident and download your free guide today. Okay, now on with the show. My guest today is Darshana Avila. We are erotic by nature. This is the core belief underlying all that Darshana offers as an erotic wholeness coach and guide. Supporting folks to establish a deeply felt sense of pleasure and ease in their bodies and relationships is her joy. Guiding folks to reconsider the stories they've been told about who they ought to be and what it takes to belong is her passion. She shares all this through a somatic sex and intimacy coaching style that is trauma-informed, justice-oriented, and nature-based. Today we discuss the difference between erotic and sexual states of being, and how we can cultivate our own eros through a connection with the natural world. Darshana shares with us how she helps folks heal from trauma and shame, and to learn and prioritize our own pleasure. To find more about her work, visit darshanaavila.com. That's DARSHANAAVILA.com. Hi, Darshana. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to have you here and talk a little bit more about erotic wholeness coaching. So I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about what that is and how you work with that in your practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, erotic wholeness coaching, it's one of these self-styled names, to be completely transparent. And it's the evolution of my work that was rooted in the somatic sex and intimacy field. Weaving into that a lot of what I have been exploring professionally and personally with relation to trauma-informed approaches, nature and soul connection, and the activism and advocacy that naturally has come into the mix of all this. And so what it's fundamentally about is helping people to experience a really profound and even uninhibited expression of pleasure and purpose in their sex lives, in their intimate relating, and in relationship to the wider world. That's what goes into erotic wholeness.
Great. And why might someone seek you out for this kind of work?
A lot of people come to me because there is a sense of something more in their field. It might be a very particular, like I'm having this pain or I'm having this problem or I see this relationship pattern showing up and they really have a pulse on what isn't working. And that might be the inroads. For others, it's just a kind of vague, almost nebulous sense that like I could be enjoying myself more. My sex could be better. I could feel more engaged in my life, or in some way feel more affirmed or express in who I am and how I'm relating. And that's often what will lead someone my way after they've, in many cases, gone through more traditional therapeutic routes and done some degree of personal growth work or spiritual exploration. And they find their way to me for whatever that next chapter is.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, one thing I'd like to just take a moment to get your perspective on is something I've actually talked with other folks who do similar work on the podcast before, which is the nuances and the differences between erotic versus sexual. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on the difference and the similarities between those two things.
Thank you. I love that question. And there is a big difference. And to me, what it is that the erotic includes our sexuality, but it's not limited to our sex alone. And in our kind of common conversations, we tend to use those words in fairly interchangeable ways. But the erotic, as I understand it, and as it is so central to the work I do, it's our sexuality, but it's also our sensuality, our creativity, our vitality. So life force energy in all its many forms and expressions is what I think of when orienting toward the erotic. Whereas our sexuality is far more narrow and specific to the ways that we express that facet of our being, the people that we might share our sexuality with, which is usually for many of us a much narrower set of options than how our erotic energy might have a potential to express itself. So by orienting toward the erotic beyond just the sexual, it really opens up possibility and pathway to be living in a state of turn on that goes far beyond the sexual and lets us have more power, more pleasure, more purpose as a baseline experience in all facets of our life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved how you said that the sexuality is a little bit more of a narrower bandwidth. I think that's what you said.
Yeah.
And I totally relate to that because I can see how both for myself and also with the folks that I work with, there's often a way that we tune into the erotic or the sensual in terms of this energy with different kinds of people that maybe we might not, quote unquote, be sexually attracted to or have as a sexual partner, or even to an experience or something like that, where we're just like, what's going on? I'm feeling this deep stirring within me, which feels really good and juicy, but it's outside of my normal sexual attraction or something like that. So I really like the way that that feels more expansive.
I'm so glad that resonates, and I agree. I often will say the phrase, we are erotic by nature, which I wholly believe to be the truth, that this is who and how we are. We are these deep sensing, feeling creatures with tremendous creative potential, and what you're describing as like an energy or, just a feeling state that we don't always have words for. Oftentimes that is the presence of the erotic, the movement of the erotic through us. And it's a really beautiful way, in my opinion anyhow, of relating with ourselves, with the people in our lives, and also with the more than human world, which from my standpoint is a very important inclusion because we are part of a more than human world. And a lot of people really suffer and struggle because of a sense of disconnect and lack of belonging to that wider web. And really tuning into our erotic nature is a wonderful pathway for also feeling ourselves more plugged into and connected to the wider nature that we are part of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's go there a little bit more because I know that one of the sort of offerings that you have in your practice is an eco-erotic exploration. And I'm not sure if we've talked about it on the show before, but there's definitely this concept of eco-sexuality and the way that we connect erotically with the natural world. So I wonder if you could share more about how you work with that with folks in this particular practice.
Absolutely. Well, so chances are, like, if somebody's listening to this without having heard the term eco-sexuality, or if the idea of eco-eroticism is new, there's a really good chance that in your mind there might be some, neurons firing, making associations between overt sexual acts and the natural world. And while that's great and fine and well, and that could absolutely be the manifestation of it, this is a great moment to hark back to thinking of the word erotic and the concept of eroticism as more than just our sex. Really, what's relevant here is to think about our sensuality, the fact of our sense faculties, the way we see, touch, taste, smell, hear, and can engage with our life through those many different dimensions. And when you bring your senses in a very wide open and intentional way into the equation when moving through the natural world, when on a walk, when swimming in a body of water, when climbing, when looking at flowers or listening to bird song or whatever it might be that you're doing, your way of relating, the more intentional we can be with engaging our senses, the more we have access to the aliveness that brings us into connection with. We're meant to be in that sensual exchange. It's part of what feeds us. It's why, in many ways, to many bodies, it feels really good to receive certain kinds of touch, to have contact, why certain smells or sounds can evoke really delicious and positive memories. And they can also do the opposite and be signals for memories that are unpleasant. But from the standpoint of a pleasure-based practice, leveraging our senses to have a deeper experience and a deeper connection with the natural world is a beautiful place and way to explore and practice with intimacy. And all that we're doing benefits our human relating. It's not to the exclusion like one or the other. It's really about a cultivation of your sensual nature and learning how to, instead of just limiting the place and time and point of contact that your erotic energy might, get to move with, to this one single human. We have a very monogamous, fidelitous, dominant cultural narrative. And I know that that's not everyone's experience and how they're living their lives, but it is the culture that we're swimming in, right? The cultural waters. And so it really narrowly confines our options for knowing ourselves as sexual or knowing ourselves as erotic. The work that I do around eco-eroticism is all about expanding the scope of what's possible. And then whatever you get to know about yourself, explore, and experience in those spaces also gets to be gifted to your human relating, however you might be expressing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also imagine, I'm thinking about, I looked on your website, on your page where you talk about eco-erotic exploration, and there's this really beautiful photo of you with a tree, like really just kind of engaging with it and connecting with it. And, thinking about that photo and probably maybe about the way that you work with some of your clients, is I imagine that for people who maybe have trauma or hesitancy around engaging with another human, that it can be a nice bridge to start to think about engaging erotically with another being that's not a human, that may feel safe. Like, I can trust this tree is not going to touch me in a way that I don't want to be touched, or that's going to re-traumatize me or, hurt me or something like that. And it also reminds me, I actually have a similar photo. I'm not sure if I still have it on my website, of me sort of nuzzling up against a tree the way I might nuzzle up against a lover or something like that. And so it makes me think about those images. And I wonder if that's part of the process or the goal in that work with folks too.
Very, very much so. I'm smiling really big just thinking about, because that's not just any tree in that photo. This is my beloved oak tree, who I have been in a deep and intimate relating with for years. And I mention that and include that to speak to what I hold as possibility for the ways that we can choose to have deep and meaningful connections beyond our human relationships and really be nourished by them. To your comment and question relevant to trauma, big giant yes. In trauma-based work through a somatic lens, everything is ultimately about introducing resource to a person who has not had it. So if fundamentally and simply stated, trauma is when something occurs that is too much, too fast, and too soon for our system to really be able to respond to it, integrate it, process through it in a good way. And something gets stuck and we stay in a loop with that trauma pattern, cycling. This can go on for a lifetime. And I would even say lifetimes, plural, if you think about intergenerational trauma. And the missing piece for us is resource to figure out, how do we interrupt that pattern and complete the cycle that didn't get to complete. And so to your point, many people, if the trauma is relational in nature, if it was a trauma that was instigated at the hands of another human or involved others, and there's a pattern then of fear or hypervigilance or shutdown, freeze, whatever it is that might happen in somebody's system, when they're faced with a trigger, it's really hard to work with that. Even if you're working with another human who's like a practitioner and a professional, such as myself, such as yourself, there can be a lot of trust issues, and rightly so. And that's absolutely part of the beauty of working with nature is there is such abundant resource that's available. What's missing for many of us, whether there's overt trauma or not, is knowing how to connect and knowing how to actually lean in to cultivate relationship with the natural world. That's something that far fewer of us grow up with exposure to. If you're somebody listening to this who happens to have benefited from growing up in a more intact culture or lived closer to the land and to nature and had that as part of your upbringing, then, oh my goodness, lucky you, at least says I. But for someone like myself who grew up in suburban New York and always lived in cities, it wasn't until my adulthood and as a big part of how I was working through my own material and following my own spiritual path that I started learning how to do anything more than just like observe nature from a fairly removed distance. Like, oh, that's nice. Or, I'd go for a swim, go for a walk, but there wasn't a real communing happening. And so that's a practice that has been transformational to me in my personal journey, and one that I deeply love sharing with my clients and my students, because it's the type of thing that once you do forge that kind of bond, that's not going to be readily undone. You're going to have access to that and know how to replicate it even more throughout your life. And thus the resource continues to stay with you. And it's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that also reminds me of a quote that is on your website. I mean, it's you. I'm quoting you.
Yeah.
But this question that you pose for your visitors to your website, which is, how can we blame ourselves for not knowing how to thrive when no one has prioritized showing us the way?
Mm-hmm.
And that just really spoke to me. And I think you could apply that to what you were just saying, just about our connection with nature. And, in my work, I talk about that with people as far as like their needs and their boundaries and the way that their parents or caretakers demonstrate that and prioritize that or don't. And I also imagine the same could be said about our connection to our erotic and nature and our sexual nature, especially as queer folks, having people who may not be attuned to the idea or the possibility or the fact that we are queer, and having to shift the way that they attune to our priorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, absolutely yes. It's, that is we're having this recording right now as we're coming out of a year of pandemic. And I would say that's like the epidemic of our times, is like we're not given what we need. We're not given role models. We don't have them oftentimes to show us how to live in a good way, how to really thrive, like, let alone survive for some people. There's a deep inheritance of trauma, of broken culture, of repression of all sorts, and oppression relevant to our many intersections of identity. In my work, a lot of that is centered around sexuality, which would include, for some people, gender identity comes into that conversation in a big way, particularly for folks who are not aligned with, who do not feel and know themselves to be in alignment with their birth, what they were assigned at birth, and are going through transition. It's like, yeah, then it really does relate to sex for many people. But just sexual orientation, even, it's like, I was working with a young lesbian couple recently, and they came to me kind of mind boggled and frustrated. They're like, yeah, like we just don't actually know how to have sex with each other. Like, it was a really earnest question. Like, where do we go? Where do we look to see examples and receive guidance of how to do anything more than simulate hetero penetrative intercourse as like the gold standard, that whatever our identities are, we're acculturated to that. And it was a very legitimate question that it was delightful to parse with them and get to explore different ways that they could choose to be sexual with each other as two cis women who love each other and want to have a satisfying sex life, and we're really stumped. So I feel like I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but just to kind of like bring it back, it really is essential. I mean, I think this is true for anyone, and I think this is especially true for queer people. We need guides. We need mentorship. We need elders. And sometimes that's not always available to us and often is not, I would say, available in our families of origin or the communities that we readily find ourselves in during our upbringing. And it takes a lot of desire and effort to seek out, where that guidance, that mentorship, that eldership might be found. And for me, the work of somatics and sexuality, I've definitely found influences there, but nature has and will continue to be one of the primary places that I go to learn about who I am and how I want to be in the world and what it means to thrive, because there's such abundant wisdom there. And in the ways that I'm able to turn around and share that back to the people that I support, it's a really deep pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I don't feel like that was a tangent at all. I think that was all on the track. Yeah.
Good. Good.
So speaking of the idea of elders and teachers, I wonder what inspired you to take up this work, and maybe who have you learned from?
It was an interesting story for me. I mean, I guess I think it's interesting, but I grew up really clear that I wasn't straight, but also equally clear that everyone on the outside looking in thought that I was. And so I felt like I had a totally monogamous relationship and totally fidelitous relationship. And during that time, I thought our sex was fine. And I wasn't necessarily feeling like I needed to explore more or differently or to be having sex with women in particular. Like that just wasn't there for me. What did end up happening when our marriage dissolved and we chose to transition that is I was also in a really deep moment of exploring my spirituality. And that was part of what drove us in different directions, is that my former husband was not interested in that. And it was ultimately then feeling dissonance between how I was exploring and expressing my sexual identity and what was going on in my spiritual life. The fact that the spiritual lineage that I was a part of at that time, which was a very traditional yogic path that I was walking, didn't have a whole lot of space for embodiment, certainly not sexuality. And it's interesting when I say like a yogic path that didn't have space for embodiment, because just because you're doing physical practices doesn't mean you're actually learning how to really inhabit your body and tune in and listen. And you made a mention earlier of, the ways that we're not taught to navigate our boundaries, our needs and wants and desires well. Like that's reinforced so readily in so many different disciplines and traditions and practices, where even with the illusion of being taught to relate to your body, it's in a very rigid way. And I feel this definitely could go off on tangents, so I will try to rein it back in. But for myself, it was that deep and somewhat ineffable sense of like, there's something missing here. There's a way that my sexuality and my spirituality can coexist, and I can feel fully and authentically expressed. I don't know what it is yet, but like something in me really wanted to find it. And so that set me off on the path that has taken many a twist and turn. I've crisscrossed the globe. I've studied with teachers and in lineages and traditions that range from classic Tantra to modern neuroscience and a whole bunch of other stuff in between. And all of that is woven into the basket, the medicine basket, if you will, that I carry and that I reach into in the work that I do now, that ultimately is about wanting people to feel that deep and authentic expression of self in their sexuality and in every aspect of their lives. And to me, the fact of being alive is a spiritual act, if you choose to orient toward it that way. Like there's no part of my life that isn't related to my spirituality and that I don't hold as sacred. And that too is a big value that I seek to impart in the guidance that I give, because when we know ourselves and one another as sacred and we come to our sex and to our erotic expression from that place is when real magic can happen. And I'm a fan of magic.
Me too. Well, speaking of what you're a fan of or anything else that might have influenced you, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
Yeah, well, so I'm going to call in one of my first and dearest mentors, a man by the name of David Cates, who is very reticent to have a public appearance. So he's not well known. He's hard to find. Sometimes he's a little more out in the world than others. But David and I met at a very pivotal moment in my life when I really was severing from the version of existence that included like a corporate career and a very mainstream way of existing in the world by and large, and was running headfirst into the exploration of everything that we've spoken of. And I landed in Bali at an event that David was leading, and it was based on a practice of his that I also share in the world called belly to belly, which is a beautiful way of cultivating intimacy and really we co-regulate with each other in this practice, which is something that I can talk more about, but I'll kind of bookmark for a moment. And David is a queer man who had been in the tantric and tantric adjacent and sexuality adjacent world for many, many more years than I had been alive, and is one of the most clear seeing beings I had ever encountered. And he could be deeply loving and kind and generous, and also just like wield like a sword of precision and ferocity when necessary and call you on your shit. And I had the good fortune of actually living with him in a small communal group that was devoted to some particular practices and explorations over the course of several months. And it changed my life and definitely set this course in motion in a huge way. So David is definitely one of my queer ancestors and elders who I am so blessed to have learned from, and feel really honored to get to share his work in the ways that I do.
Beautiful. Well, it sounds like there's so much more that we could talk about, but we are out of time. So can you share with us how people can find you and learn more about your work and what you're up to?
So best ways to find me are my website, which is my name, darshanaavila.com, or on Instagram. My handle there is Erotic Wholeness. And primarily I work with women and couples. And so that's cis and trans women and their partners of any gender. And my coaching is primarily one-to-one or one-to-couple. And I also have some group events and workshops that I offer. Some of them are more sporadic. Every month there is a full moon self-touch sex magic ritual that is available to all women. And you can find details about all that in either of those places, Instagram or website. And it would be an honor to connect with any of the Queer Spirit listeners. If you feel to reach out with any questions or inquiries, happy to receive them. And just really grateful to be invited into this conversation, Nick. Thank you so much.
Well, we will have those links on the show notes so people can find them more easily there. And thank you, Darshana, for being here and sharing more about erotic wholeness and liberation. So thank you.
My pleasure.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.